Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to hear so much buzz of conversation in the room already. That's fantastic, and sorry to bring it to a temporary halt. Hello and welcome to the Royal Society of Edinburgh's annual spring event, the signature event. I'm delighted to welcome both our in-person audience and those watching live stream on YouTube. In person, we have 140 people, and online 350. So we're almost at 500 together in a community enjoying this evening's event. I am Professor Sarah Skerritt, in case you just think this random person has wandered up to the podium, and I'm Chief Exec here at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, or RSE, and I'm deeply honoured to be welcoming you to this evening's event on this critically important topic. Before we get started tonight, there are a few things to run through. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if you hear the fire alarm, please follow the evacuation route shown on this slide, and the RSE staff, who will wave from the back, one's demonstrating now, will guide you on where to go. It's to the Dome. That is a bar and restaurant. You're to assemble outside, not inside. So there will be time for audience questions later on in the event. When you have a question, please raise your hand and a member of the RSE staff team will bring you a microphone. For the online audience, please type any questions in the chat and we'll read them out for you. That chat is being moderated. We also know that tonight's topic won't be an easy one for everyone. So we've a few things in place for you if you feel you need them at any time. We have a quiet room set up next to the reception desk. If you find that you do need a moment, please ask a member of the staff team on the desk and they will show you where that is. We also have Fee, who is our mental health first aider, on hand, who's wearing a green lanyard and a badge, and she will guide you to that room as well. There's also a list of organisations to talk to if you feel you need to do so at any point after the event, so please pick up a list of those at reception on your way out if you would like to do so. So on to this evening and the event. Here at the RSE, our mission over the last 240 years has always been and still is making knowledge useful. And this event this evening is part of our signature event series, which does just that. This series is designed to encourage new thinking, ideas, and conversations by bringing some of the brilliant minds from across Scotland and beyond to the RSE, sharing their knowledge and ideas with us all and provoking our thinking. Today's event is no different. We're delighted to have Darren McGarvey bringing his first show of his new series, Trauma Industrial Complex, to the stage here at the RSE. Darren, as most of you in this room will know, and that's why you're here, is an award-winning author and broadcaster, most recently hitting our screens with his BBC documentary series, The State We're In. His debut book, Poverty Safari, won the Orwell Prize for Political Writing in 2018. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, inducted in 2023, having published 2 works of outstanding literary merit. Darren is also a critically acclaimed hip-hop artist, releasing music under the alias Loki, and a regular fixture at the Edinburgh Fringe. Joining Darren tonight in his exploration of trauma is Miriam Taylor. Welcome. A non-clinical psychotherapist, supervisor, writer, and international trainer. Miriam is now retired from clinical practice, having specialised in trauma for over 25 years. Miriam includes aspects of collective trauma, social justice issues, and climate change in her thinking on trauma, with an interest in the formation of intersecting relational processes which create traumatic experiences. This event tonight is undoubtedly going to make us reflect on the way trauma impacts our lives, but I will let Darren and Miriam lead you on this exploration for us all. It is therefore with such great pleasure that I welcome to the stage tonight's first speaker, Miriam Taylor. Thank you.
thank you so much for the warm welcome and for the introduction. And thank you to everybody here and online for giving up your evening to this important subject. It's a bit wild for me to be here speaking to an audience that, as far as I know, is composed of people from the general public, more used to talking to therapists. But it's also a kind of natural place to be. When I read Darren's 2 books, both of them soon after they were written, I grabbed them very quickly. I realised that he was writing about trauma through the lens of social justice issues. And in parallel to that, I was developing my own training and writing about social justice issues through the lens of trauma. So I think we've hopefully got a good place to meet here. I want to try and run past you 3 ideas. They are connected. The first one, Darren has asked me to try and define trauma for you in non-clinical language. It's by far the most difficult of the three things I want to offer you, because there's something about trauma that doesn't want to be defined. It has its own kind of shapelessness and ungraspability. I sometimes think it's like trying to capture smoke in a net. So you get hold of one thread, and as soon as you think you've got it, it disappears and something else comes up. So it doesn't want to be pinned down. It doesn't want to be defined and put in a box. It has its own kind of energy, which is interesting. But let's try this. I'm going to give it a try. I'm not going to promise to send you away from here with a clear idea of what this is about. But I'm going to suggest that trauma it's not a thing. It is the way that certain kinds of events and experiences get imprinted on an individual's life and their being, and particularly on their body. I'll come back to that in a bit. So, for a definition, it is the effect of an event, an experience, or a relationship that overwhelms our capacity to cope on our own. I'll repeat that. It's the effect of an event, an experience, or a relationship that overwhelms our capacity to cope on our own. Now, I'll unpack that a bit. When I say it's an effect, I'll come back to that in a minute. But let's look at that word, at those words: event, experience, relationship. The event might be something quite concrete, like a car crash or an assault. So something kind of with relatively clear, a relatively clear beginning and end. When I use the term experience, I'm really thinking about the kind of contexts in which trauma really thrives. So it might be an experience of, well, we could say living in a war zone, or living on a sink estate, or living in brown or black skin in a white dominant society. And when I talk about a relationship, I'm talking about particular kinds of relationships with intimate partners, relationships with bullies, with people who matter to you that really change the way you feel about yourself in the world. And sometimes those three things intersect. So, for example, we can think about the pandemic as being the experience, the context in which we know that there was a huge increase in domestic violence. So that's the relationship part. And there may have been specific events within that, such as assault or rape. So that those three things come together. Sometimes. We can't always separate things out. Okay, so that's the next word that I want to focus on is overwhelm. And a dictionary definition gives us words like feeling overpowered, feeling defeated, or annihilated. That's quite a huge experience. So really, when we're overwhelmed, we're completely trapped. We're completely out of options. We're helpless. There's nothing that we can do. It overwhelms our ability to cope. Yeah, there's nothing that we can do. Okay. So the effects of this. I'm going to just give you a couple. The first is an absolutely pervasive sense of fear, or perhaps more accurately, we can call it terror. It's a kind of feeling that gets under your skin. It gets into your guts. It gets into your heartbeat. It gets into your breath. It gets into your nervous system. It floods your body with toxic chemicals. If you're little, or if you're a teenager and you're living with an experience or a relationship, something ongoing that creates a chronic trauma, these effects may actually alter the structures the development of certain structures in your brain. So that's pretty serious. Trauma has been suggested to be one of the most serious of all mental health conditions. That comes from the Journal of Psychiatry. Put that against a tweet that I read a while ago, and I'm not kidding here. It said something to the effect of, OMG, I'm so traumatized to discover that Boston is further north than New York. So we have a whole range of stuff here going on, and no wonder it's important that we try to understand what it means. So as a clinician, I need different language from what was implied in that tweet. Now, of course, we don't know what the person who wrote that tweet had in mind when they chose to use that language, when they chose to broadcast this piece of knowledge that they just gained. But I think it does hold another possible clue to one of the big effects of trauma. There's a quality of disorientation that it conveyed. Trauma has this feeling of being, as I suggested earlier, of not being quite what you think it is. I sometimes use the image M.C. Escher's staircase, when you don't know which way is up. It has that disorientation and dislocation. I think the idea of dislocation is a really important concept in understanding trauma. Judith Herman Lewis, one of the great trauma writers talked about trauma as breaching attachments of friendship and family and society. She wrote about how it tears apart the victim's fundamental assumptions about the safety of the world, the value of the self, and the meaningful order of creation. This is why this is worthy of the kind of attention we need to give it. So that's my attempt at that first definition. The second point that I want to try and get across quickly is that this way of thinking about trauma focuses on the individual. And we need to take into account, among other really important things like genetics and transgenerational trauma and personality factors, we also need to take into account those experiences that I referred to earlier, those contexts in which trauma thrives. Because if we don't do that, we're missing half the picture, and if we don't do that, we risk ending up blaming the individual when there may be systemic processes that are really important in shaping this person's experience. So the narrative in the trauma world is shifting from one of what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Now, that's not without its detractors, it's not without its critics and its problems, but it's a useful consideration. Trauma often, I believe, involves an imbalance of power, where there is a powerful person or system sitting in the place of a perpetrator, and there is the victim or the oppressed person on the other side of that. So often involving those dynamics of power and oppression, which I think is kind of helps to define this quite well. Now, I know that some of you have come from mental health organisations. So the third point I want to make might be quite shocking and controversial to you. And it's about the current narrative of being trauma-informed. You see it all over the place, and it is all over the world. I've worked with people from many countries who kind of drowning in what this trauma-informed term means. So the bit that might shock you is that I don't consider myself to be a trauma-informed therapist, for the simple reason that we do not have a consensus about what that means. I've come across teaching assistants who've gone off and done a 3-hour workshop and come back and said, we're trauma-informed. That's one end. The other end is for people to have done months, years even, of specialist training. I don't know where we define, between those two extremes, where we define the point at which someone becomes trauma-informed. Often, forgive me if this is controversial, often organisations write their policies from the perspective of being trauma-informed. That's a good thing, right? Well, maybe. They may go on to make some changes in the environment. They put in comfy chairs and a pot plant and a picture on the wall. And that's nice too, isn't it? I don't know what difference that makes to the individuals who come for help. It doesn't tell me anything if I'm looking for help. It doesn't tell me anything about how I might feel safe when I sit in a room with another person. Because the quality of listening in an open-hearted and compassionate way, of showing that we do understand how trauma works, that's something that I don't think you can pin down in a prescriptive way. I don't think that we can make policies for that, for those personal qualities that will make the difference for those individuals. So I'm sorry if I've kind of thrown the cat among the pigeons about that, but I do think we need to have a conversation about what we really mean. Until we do, the trauma-informed is being set up as a gold standard, but there isn't any standard that goes with it. And so we'll find out where this conversation goes. That's as much as I'm going to say at the moment. I'm really delighted to hand over to Darren. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Miriam. It's nice to put someone on first as a human shield. I say that, obviously, with a lot of gratitude. Thank you for everyone who's come tonight, who's watching online. Thank you to Hannah at the RSE and the whole team here for accommodating us and organising this event. And just before I start, I just want to paint a picture of how close to my heart this is and the level of proximity that I have to these issues. I arrived here 30 minutes later than I said I was going to be here, having just been spat out of a therapy session in Glasgow. I got here, arrived in the green room, and immediately started oversharing. So I'm sharing to one person, Hannah, who I've never met in person until then, about what my day has been like. And then another person, who I've only met online, steps in and says, Darren, boundaries. Now that is not an unusual day for me. So what you're looking at right now is the reality of being a person with lived experience of trauma, who's currently in active trauma, and bizarrely finds himself trapped in his own drawing of his life. The feeling that something terrible is about to happen never leaves me for long. Whatever public face I portray, privately I am always preparing for the final calamity. When I can't reach my wife by phone, long after she is due home, I worry she may be mangled in a traffic accident. Stood in the playground waiting for my kids to come out of school at the end of the day, I suffer dreadful surges of anxiety that one of them may have gotten lost on the 50-yard walk from the gate and the entrance after I dropped them. I imagine the moment a teacher insists my son never came to school in response to my asking, where is he? Whenever I get a call from a family member, I inhale deeply before answering, anticipating an emergency or death. And in my role as a writer and commentator paid to express my opinions publicly with self-assurance, behind the curtain I live in fear of punishment, humiliation, or some other cruel form of reprisal, simply for the crime of expressing my thoughts and feelings. I feel in daily life, for long stretches of most days, the way I imagine fearful flyers must, 30,000 feet above the earth. And to borrow a well-worn turn of phrase, for me, turbulence is other people. I can't be around anyone for too long without feeling the urge to leave, even just momentarily, to catch my proverbial breath. Moreover, I will not go anywhere unless I have an exit plan in place, and I become restless and agitated the longer I must linger. Mid-conversation, I may tune out and become preoccupied by facial expressions, body language, or what's going on around or behind me. My social instincts seem calibrated for a particular purpose. They seem set to detect, track, and anticipate in every interaction I have the intention, temperament, and mood of the other person. It could be a stranger on a bus, a fan at a book signing, or my own wife walking in the door from work. What I need to know before anything else can unfold is that I am safe and secure. And I have been like this for as long as I can remember. Into the bargain, every now and then, for no reason at all, scenes from what feel like my past project themselves intrusively onto the busy wall of my waking mind. These scenes do not follow any specific pattern. They are not triggered by any specific stimulus. And I rarely recall them voluntarily. Yet when they do arise, it can feel very much like I've never stopped thinking about them. I couldn't even tell you which order these events fall on my internal timeline. All I can say is that for most of my life, these little movies have been playing in the dark recesses of what I have always assumed to be my memory. Despite my recollection that almost all of them occurred before I was 10 years old, their detail remains vivid. I could not say what year each event took place, nor what happened the days before or after. These movies exist only as contextless fragments connected by one thread. They were all, I believe, experienced by me. I push a cat off a window ledge. It claws the wall outside. I am crying at the front door of a nursery as my favourite teacher explains that she is leaving. I don't want her to go. My mother screams as she rushes out the door and down the stairs, partially clothed, to retrieve a cat. We are now on a rare family walk. My mother and father are both present. This is what normal feels like. My mother lets a dog off the leash. The dog is hit by a joyrider on a motorbike and thrown into the air. The vehicle scrapes to a halt in a trail of sparks. Why do things like this always happen to us? There is a thunder and lightning storm. I am alone in a dark room. The window is open. I am now suspended outside, hanging upside down in the rain. I am now inside a cupboard with another child, a girl. Sunlight is breaking through the locked doors. I hear people outside laughing. Older kids. They won't let us out until we kiss. I am watching a black cat walking on a kitchen counter by an open window. My mother is crying. She is punching a man in a black motorcycle helmet as a dog howls by the roadside. Now I am lying in the bottom bunk bed late at night. Other children are nearby. One is a baby. Is everyone okay? You sure? Will I keep going? One is a baby. It's daytime. A man kicks a baby across the floor. I look out the window of a high-rise. Another child is tied to a chair. I don't know who the man is. I can't do anything to help anyone. There is a tussle between adults. I am picked up and carried out of a house by a woman with brown skin, into a car and driven to another place where a painting of a man in a kilt holding bagpipes is mounted on the wall. My mother is in the garden. She's trying to dig up the dog buried there the day before. She is crying. She is asking for my help. I am torn. I want to help her. I want to make her happy. The neighbours are all out. We are not normal. My auntie stands at the top of the back door stairs, pleading for me to come inside the house. I am back in the dark room with my siblings and the bunk beds. We are trying to stay quiet so the man at the door thinks we are not home. I arrive home after school. Charred furniture is piled up in the front garden. I am embarrassed because I have a friend with me. A teacher bangs her fist on a desk and screams at me. She makes me admit to something I did not do in front of the class. I am in a phone box explaining that my mum is in the toilet bleeding. My granny puts the phone down and tells me there has been a fire at my house. My granny pulls me away from a woman with a melted face. My granny makes me feel safe. A terrapin swims in an old chip pan in a dark smoke-filled room. My mum is showing me how to throw a punch. She tells me to put my thumb inside my fist. A glass bottle shatters on the wall behind me as I duck behind a couch. An old woman with a melted face laughs. A budgie is celebrated for being able to say bad words. My mother is annoyed because I won't go to bed. I am showing off in front of her friends. She walks into the kitchen and takes a knife from a drawer. I run upstairs to my bedroom. My mum walks into my classroom to fight a teacher who frightened me. A fireball rises to the ceiling from a chip pan. We run out of a narrow kitchen and into a hall. I am walking across open ground between two high-rise flats in a storm to get cigarettes for my mum and a man. I am blown off my feet and across the grass. An angry teacher kicks open the door of the boys' dorm and threatens to kick fuck out of all of us if we don't go to sleep. Sure, that was a trauma-informed school as well. He is the same teacher I seen attacking my friend. He is the same teacher the girls feel uncomfortable around. He is the teacher I'm supposed to go to if I have problems at school. All the other teachers are scared of him too. Adults are watching me from the window of a high-rise as I lie on the ground. I have so far to walk. Adults are watching me. I have so far to walk and I am afraid to stand in case I blow away. I think they are laughing at me. My mum is angry I am frightened of a bully. She takes me to his house and makes me fight with him in the street. Other children are watching us. A teacher asks, "What happened to my jacket? The one I was wearing when I blew away." An angry drunk man is screaming threats through a letterbox in the middle of the night. He's kicking the door. If he breaks through, I will not be able to protect the children. We are not safe. Nobody is coming to help us. It may not surprise you that somewhere along the line I acquired the idea that my life was uniquely tragic. How or when this notion took shape, I cannot be sure. Was it the alcoholic mother whose unreliability plagued my early years? Maybe the deprived community I was raised in, notable for the poverty, violence and addiction it so effortlessly reproduced. Perhaps leaving the family home abruptly at 16 before becoming a homeless alcoholic in my early 20s was the genesis of this narrative. Or possibly the reactions of shock and sadness on other people's faces when I regaled them with detailed accounts of family dysfunction. Maybe that did the job. Whichever way this idea took root, whether a sudden epiphany or a gradual view constructed over years, the belief that my upbringing was hard and had damaged me beyond repair at some stage became the controlling idea of my story. A story that was almost as hard to bear as the trauma itself. Like many of my generation, a reluctant millennial, I came of age at the dawn of a 21st century which promised so much. My cohort blossomed in a cultural sweet spot where information was becoming more accessible, but the tentacles of the internet weren't quite scurrying around in our pockets like they are today. It was a far less informed but far simpler time to be young, when traditional media always got the last word on what was true, on who was good or bad, and on what was considered cool, and the family doctor always got the last word on what was wrong when you didn't feel well. Back then, pop stars and not podcasts ruled the airwaves. What many of the artists of the day were singing, shouting and rapping about was their personal problems. Unlike the moody grunge of Nirvana, where listeners were often left to speculate as to the true meaning behind the lyrics to a song like Underneath the Bridge. What the hell is that song about? The biggest pop artists of my day were far more literal when offering their perspectives. Queen's gangster rapper 50 Cent traded on being shot 9 times. Kanye West captured the charts with his account of a near-fatal car crash that left him with his jaw wired. Well, perhaps the story with the biggest impact of any artist in this period of putting it all out there was burgeoning global superstar Eminem's accounts of trailer park poverty, marital dysfunction, and the child neglect he experienced at the hands of his pill-popping alcoholic mother, beamed into millions of homes, cars, and headsets every hour of the day. These artists didn't want to change the world like Public Enemy, or wax poetic on the pitfalls of modernity like Radiohead. These precocious upstarts wanted to talk about themselves and their lived experiences. More than that, they offered detailed accounts of their adversities, which were as shocking as they were intriguing, and by purging their frustrations, their heartaches, and their traumas in their music, they modelled a mode of self-expression to troubled teenagers like me, struggling to forge an identity. This willingness on the part of artists to disclose their personal tribulations publicly in exchange for greater visibility, adulation, and financial success was part of a general shift in culture across all forms of media. The noughties were a golden age of airing dirty linen publicly, and some freak shows were trashier than others. From bear-baiting daytime talk vehicles to primetime weekend talent shows, men and women and children routinely risked scandalising themselves for a shot at fortune and fame, for the promise of feeling loved, accepted and secure. In 2001, grieving the sudden death of my mother and reeling from a family breakdown, I attempted to emulate my favourite artists, seeking salvation, catharsis, and above all, acceptance by hastily upcycling personal adversity into my best attempt at art. The first song I ever wrote was called Seems Like Only Yesterday. The lyrics were actually written before my mother passed away, before I left home, and were intended as an attempt at reconciliation after many years of feeling angry at her for leaving. Across the 4 verses, I depicted my experiences of growing up with her as she descended further into alcoholism, as narrated through the eyes of a child. When I wrote the song, I hadn't really considered the idea it would ever be performed. It was for her and for me. It was my way of letting her know that I was trying to forgive her and that I understood on some level she suffered from an illness and wasn't a bad person. Whether I truly believed that, I couldn't say. But the song, at the risk of invoking a horrific cliche, wrote itself. As fate would have it, she passed away before I could play it to her, and so by accident it became a tribute song. I recorded it and I liked how it sounded, and I took rap up as a serious hobby. I am by nature a seeker. When I have a target I'm aiming for, the noise of the world around me and my own head dims to the point of becoming bearable. With rap as my new obsession, there was a thread by which I could pull myself through adversity. Growing up in a community where creative expression was frowned upon among young men, rapping allowed me to remain engaged in a creative process from within the patina of street credibility, which seemed necessary to successfully navigate social environments dominated by young men as obsessed with appearing tough as I was with writing raps. And unlike many of them, who fabricated their experiences to seem tougher than they were, I had an authentic hard luck story. I had the talent. All I needed was an audience. I began performing locally and making a name for myself, and was after a time invited to conferences and onto radio and television to recount my experiences. This growing public interest in my story granted me countless opportunities throughout the years, and despite the many challenges I faced, I established myself as an effective community artist, activist and performer. The 2010s brought with it social media, which effectively turned me into my own publisher. And with a growing sense of my audience came new confidence I was on the right track. There seemed an endless interest in my accounts of adversity, homelessness, and my own descent into alcoholism and addiction, as well as my commentary and analysis of the socio-economic conditions such adversities in which they tend to occur. The interest culminated in the publication of my 2017 debut book, Poverty Safari, part memoir, part social commentary, in which I revealed, among other things, traumatic experiences from my childhood. I wasn't the only person putting it all out there. By this point, the type of personal disclosure in which I seemed to excel had not only penetrated media, publishing and the arts, but had become a mainstay of civic discourse. Decision makers, charities and philanthropists began to see the value in hearing the perspectives of those of us who had experienced many of the challenges they and their organisations had a stake in addressing. My new prominence as a writer and broadcaster rendered me a de facto poster child for the boundless merits of what came to be known as lived experience. A concept we'll explore shortly. Every other day I was making public appearances, filing opinion columns, performing on stage. After many long years of adversity, when I struggled to get sober, unaware of the true impact of my traumatic experiences earlier in life, I was now a professional and a public figure and an expert. No longer on the margins. I was finally included. I was finally important. I was finally loved and accepted. Telling your tragic story, it seemed, was how you made the best of your bad luck. After years of doors being slammed in my face as an aspiring artist and writer, people were now interested. My arc was complete. Overcoming the odds, I was at last redeemed. People loved my story, my lived experience, and by extension, they loved me. What even is lived experience? And what other plane can experience occur but through life being lived? What is this special genre of experience that we who have suffered adversity must always be designated, which somehow doesn't apply to everyone else? I'll admit I'm not a fan of the term itself, though I am a strong advocate of the principle underpinning it. If you spend enough time online, you're sure to encounter someone like me. We have strong opinions, which we often express with passion and conviction. We believe our experiences are important, that they may shed light on certain social and cultural challenges, backfilling the knowledge gap so evident among a well-meaning managerial class. From addiction to homelessness, criminal justice, gender-based violence, racism, housing, mental health and trauma, our lived experiences, which take the form of stories, are regarded by many, and by ourselves, as the solutions to a complex puzzle. Missing pieces which, when truly grasped by decision makers and wider society, could help shape a more compassionate, informed and inclusive future. But that's not the whole story. A lived experience is also a commodity, one which adds immeasurable value to workplaces, academic research and media enterprises dominated by middle-class professionals. Everyday lived experience permeates culture, driving engagement on social media platforms, generating millions of views, clicks and comments. Posts and status updates, online think pieces, video essays, news segments and short-form clips online are disseminated, debated and deconstructed. In a free market, our willingness to eagerly supply the rapacious demand for authenticity and social realism can certainly leave us with a sense that we are finally making waves, that we are having an impact and making a difference. Regrettably, the allure of presenting ourselves as recovered, because that's the nice little bow most people want their affirming lived experience testimonies wrapped up in, may pull us further from the truth of who we are and what we really suffer from. In essence, by falsely portraying ourselves as the finished article, our vulnerability increases, not least in the current climate. The lived experience movement is caught in a crossfire between tribes of a culture war. The term rouses prejudice and suspicion in many. It's regarded by critics as a phrase worthy of woolly-minded do-gooders and social justice warriors, a Trojan horse that smuggles subjective, unscientific, politically motivated anecdotes and personal opinions into serious matters of science and politics. Those with lived experience, it is often claimed, are granted special privileges in discussions and debates on social issues like race, sexual expression and class, and being seen to challenge or contradict them may get you into quite a bit of bother. Conversely, in more liberal circles, lived experience is often held up as the gold standard where understanding the human impact of social inequalities is concerned. People with lived experience are revered, wrapped in cotton wool, and paraded before captive audiences keen to gorge themselves on social authenticity, as well as organisations keen to be seen platforming marginalised perspectives. Every anecdote is accepted as a statement of fact, and fear of being seen to invalidate the lived experiences of traumatised victims and survivors too often takes precedent over the need to ground discussion and debate firmly within the realm of truth. While wonderful lip service is paid to the value of all lived experience, some lived experiences receive prominence or priority over others depending on the objectives or political agendas of the institutions involved in generating the discussion. Sometimes that's entirely appropriate. Sometimes it's a bit cynical. Lived experience also elicits assumptions which are not as safe as they appear. We are believed always to be acting in service of a cause, and never in our own interests, despite the clear perverse incentives at play. We may receive prominence in our community or media, be offered public speaking gigs, or in my case, book deals, television shows. I'd be lying if I said I'd not developed an acute awareness of how my story and how I tell it can leverage opportunities. While people with lived experience in the organisations platforming us often have noble intentions, we do also harbour ulterior motives, like people in every other walk of life. We have grievances to air, scores to settle, resentments to act out beneath veils of earnest political campaigning. While it's entirely understandable that personal testimony of a lived experience must be treated with sensitivity, there are implications where every experience is taken automatically at face value. Lived experiences are not interrogated like other forms of evidence, despite increasingly being asserted as fact and submitted into social policy decision-making, not just by testifiers turned campaigners, but also by organisations, agencies and institutions to which lived experiences provide a certain level of political propulsion and cover in the face of challenge or criticism. Essentially, lived experience is often exploited unintentionally by organisations who use it to create shortcuts and through roads in areas such as public relations, political campaigning and fundraising. Meanwhile, those who divulge their lived experiences are very rarely involved in decision-making and must instead learn to view their traumatic experiences as a form of capital, to be traded in exchange for exposure, employment, educational opportunities. In essence, this sector at its worst functions like every other industry under capitalism. It is governed by the same perverse incentives. And I'm nearly done, don't worry. While my case may seem an unusual one, most people with lived experience will never write books about it or gain media prominence. The pitfalls for those of us who decide to disclose aspects of our trauma publicly at whatever level are the same. And this is really what this campaign is about. We may be prompted onto a platform to air our trauma publicly by others who have done no such thing, and are therefore ill-equipped to provide the necessary insight, support or aftercare we may require. Our expectations may inadvertently rise, sensing we are on the cusp of some breakthrough, which has previously eluded us, only to be dealt a crushing blow upon the realisation that people we thought were friends and allies, because we often attach intensely to anyone who gives us the time of day. We're simply associates engaged in a transaction. And we may experience the nip of negative consequences when our stories reach a level of prominence we did not foresee, provoking unpleasant reactions in others, be they strangers we'll never meet or friends and family members who share neither our recollections of what happened nor our desire to make a public display of it. This lived experience moment ought to come with some caveats, not simply for the benefit of those of us putting it all out there, but also to people on the lower slopes of their own recovery from trauma who look to us with a platform for an example to follow, like we did our favourite artists. There is a darker side to this lived experience moment, which must be articulated with great care so as not to stoke unnecessary tumult. Hang on a wee second. Though I suspect those currently riding the wave will find some of what I am going to do in this campaign extremely challenging, no matter how delicately it's put. So let me first say this. I do not believe people with lived experience are being deliberately exploited by anyone. We have agency and participate willingly in most cases. I wish to cast no aspersions on organisations which have in recent years sought to platform, collaborate with, or even employ the lived experience. My concern is that we, the individuals being invited to share intimate details of our lives, are often not as well as we believe. We are often not as firm in our footing in life as we appear. Indeed, the demons of childhood trauma we'd all like to think long banished wait patiently. We worry that showing vulnerability may result in a withdrawal of interest, abandonment. We're afraid to assert ourselves and our needs, so make commitments we are unsure we can fulfil while accepting terms and conditions we often sense are unfair, conflict averse, and overly compliant. And we often don't understand the fullness of the consequences that may lie ahead when we agree to sing for our suppers. Impulsivity, lack of boundaries. Our desire to help others, to participate, to be seen to be achieving, and yes, to gain affection and security and love is often so overwhelming that we push aside any lingering doubt as to our fitness to engage in the risky public exhibitionism which may come to define us. And let's not forget, we decant our traumas into a rowdy and unforgiving and radioactive public square where once disclosed cannot be undisclosed. There is no shortage of rancour between those who blindly revere lived experiences and those who instinctively doubt them. But rarely does anyone have anything pointed to say to the people with lived experiences themselves. We're too vulnerable, you see. Well, that's where I come in, as a fully paid up member of the lived experience movement. My impulse to overshare leaves me with crippling anxiety in the aftermath. Unguarded remarks I have made in good faith about past attitudes and behaviours have been seized upon and reframed as admissions of guilt and evidence of my being dangerous and suspect. If I search my own name online, a slew of articles appears in which my mother is invariably depicted as a monstrous abuser. Traumas I revealed believing they would help others have been weaponised against me by detractors. And stories I thought were my own to tell were in fact the shared property of others too, whose perspectives and feelings I never considered prior to disclosure. People I'll never meet know more about me than my own children. I am so grateful to anyone throughout the years who has taken the immense risk of encouraging me to keep my powder dry, to edit some graphic detail out, to keep some grave revelation to myself. You better have your ducks in a row before you let the genie out of the bottle. Because if I could go back, I wouldn't have told the world half the things I did. Thank you. Can I just jump up there? Yeah.
10, 15 minutes. Do you want
Cool. That was intense.
It was.
Everybody okay? Is that, do you need help? Can we help you? Right, okay. Emotional frankness, I like that. Okay. How are you?
Yeah, I was a bit shaken by the amount. There was something about the amount of detail that you put into that.
Yeah.
And what you did it really skillfully, actually, because when you asked me to try and define trauma, I thought, well, we're going to be up here. And what you did was really give a live kind of demonstration of it, and of that fragmentary nature, you know, things that are coming thick and fast, and they don't make sense because there's no thread that runs through them. Yeah.
Yeah, and when I was reading that passage, which on the document is in italics, just to sort of let the reader know that it's a bit different from the rest of the body of the text. And as I was reading it, there got to a point where I was like, the first time I done it, when I was practicing it, it's from the rough draft of the book that I'm working on.
Yeah.
And so I'm reading through it, and normally you get to it, you sort of know, you have a rhythm of when you know something's going on too long, and that's when you stop. But that's not how trauma works. And so what I wanted to do was similar to what some comedians do, where they sense they're losing the faith of the room because they're hammering a joke too hard, and they just keep going. And they just keep going until the people in the room start to understand why they're doing that. Because that's what trauma is like. It's like you're vomiting it up. It's just landing on everything around you. And whether people understand that that's the intent behind the way that it's shared, I don't know. Maybe some people will think it's excessive in its detail, but I've got to be authentic to how I express myself, because for me, this subject is too close to my heart.
Yep.
And if I'm going to talk about trauma, I need to authenticate myself in the minds of the people watching so that they can say, that sounds like trauma. He doesn't sound like a Piers Morgan, cynical type of person who just doesn't like people who are a bit sensitive. Seems like he's in a process of recovery himself. That was the sort of vibe I was going for, Miriam.
I get that. And yet, I said that when I read your books, I knew you were writing about trauma. Now, was that because I had a particular sensitivity, and part of my sensitivity comes from lived experience? I'm curious about what's enough for you.
Yeah. In terms of disclosure?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of aspects to it, because when I was writing that, I felt a catharsis. See, when I did the last book that didn't have a lot of lived experience in it, people didn't enjoy reading it as much. People didn't buy it as much. People said they bought it, but they hadn't finished it yet. And that's because there's not a personal narrative pulling them through every page. So the question for me came when I was like, why did I write a book like that? And I wrote a book like that because I thought that's the book people wanted me to write. I thought people thought, I've got a platform, so I have to write about class and social inequality, or I'm not being true to my community. But I hated every minute of writing that fucking book. It was torture. I believe every word I wrote in it. I researched it thoroughly, but it took me a year to edit it.
But you didn't put yourself into it.
I didn't put myself in it because I was like, I've said too much, I need to pull back. I never planned to do this project. I was just sitting, observing a discussion about trauma occurring online in the absence of clinical guidance in mental health services in the real world, and recognising that trauma was beginning to become this Rorschach answer to every question for some people.
Yeah.
And while I completely acknowledge the pain and confusion and perhaps lack of meaning and support in anyone's life who is looking out to the online world for an answer to explain how they feel. Trauma has to be diagnosed. It has to cross a clinical threshold. There is a certain danger when we take a story as profound and powerful as trauma and integrate that into a sense of identity because it feels right. Because most of the people out there who I encounter on the front line as a journalist, they're living with trauma and they don't know about it. They're living with trauma and they would never think to get up on a stage and talk about it. And in fact, in the lived experience movement, someone like me is seen as representative of a whole cross-section of people who are addicts or grew up in poverty or have trauma. But actually the fact that I get up and talk about it means I'm not representative of those people. So there are certain things that need to be clarified where we talk about trauma, and you've already alluded to its instability in terms of being cohesively defined, even among experts. So imagine what happens when that moves from being a clinical term to a colloquial thing. I'm traumatised. I didn't know Boston was more north of Carolina or whatever it was.
Yeah.
People traumatised by public transport, traumatised by somebody going like that. You're a dickhead, man. Shut up, wind your neck in, you're talking shite. Oh, they think conflict is trauma, they think criticism is trauma, and while I understand it's uncomfortable and while I understand there might be trauma at the root of it, if you're just walking around with a story in your head about how you're traumatised and you haven't actually sought any guidance or insight, the story's almost as powerful as the trauma.
That, I think, is where there's a problem. Yeah.
And
so, go on.
No, I was inviting you to continue, but you take your time to think about what you're saying, so I'm getting into the rhythm.
Yeah. I think there's not enough because trauma has a way of kind of narrowing our focus, and we come up really close to it, so close that we kind of get burnt and go on getting burnt. And it's really difficult to step outside of it enough to be able to say, to reflect on, is this a good thing to share? What might the consequences be? What is the story behind the trauma of getting stuck in traffic or finding that Boston's further north than New York, or you know, because it's not been processed enough. I don't. That sounds like a bit of a clinical term, but it hasn't been worked with enough. There's not enough distance. Is really part of the problem.
As part of this campaign, this is going to be like the first sort of part of it, and then we'll go into a run of podcasts. I have a podcast as well, and so there are going to be different mediums and forums and places that you can engage with us in different ways. And one of the people I interviewed for it that will be published soon is I interviewed my child psychologist, Marilyn, who I write about in Poverty Safari. And I interviewed her because I didn't actually know if I had been treated for trauma when I worked with her all those years ago. So I had to get clarification. And then I was thinking, well, that's interesting, actually, going back into the past and talking to people who have not heard the story I retell over and over again, who just know me from then, and what did they think, and what was I really like? And so it was then it started to make sense that for me to engage with this topic through a book, I had to be personal, because it's like a case study where I'm saying, here are the consequences of telling your story publicly. The potential consequences, and I'm on the extreme end. And for me also, I had to find out trauma and the story of trauma as being a big part of my life. I had to go and verify if it was true. I mean, which might seem, in this area of affirm what everyone believes no matter what, it might seem radical. It is radical. How many stories have you got about your life? Why you got sacked? Why your relationship broke down? Why your pal doesn't talk to you? That you tell yourself, which is nothing close to the truth of it. Our life is comprised of these stories that help us to make sense of why our life is the way it is, and a story that we can live with. And all humans do that. But when it comes to something like trauma, which is a very difficult kind of energy, then you can't just be on transmit all the time about the story of it. Healing from trauma is about having conversations you don't want to have.
Yeah.
If you feel comfortable getting up and talking about your trauma, that's not what you need to be talking about. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So just the whole way that the discussion publicly is set up around it runs contrary to the actual reality of trauma, active trauma, in a lot of instances. I know there will always be exceptions to rules, but the book is basically me trying to clarify all that while all the time saying, look, I'll go first. I'm full of shite. You know what I mean? I love attention. I want to make money. Do you know what I mean? And then making it safe for other people just to put their pride aside and go, trauma's not the only thing going on with me right now.
I worry that some people might, I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here, might take your example and spill it all without any context, without any support. You've got some support, or you've at least got ways of finding it. And you used the word vulnerable. I think there are two kinds of vulnerable. There's the kind of vulnerable that leaves you open for people to go on hurting you. It's like saying, hey, I'm a doormat, you know, kind of this is what's happened. There's another kind of vulnerable, which is a useful kind of vulnerable. It's got its strength in it. It's because it's saying, I'm a human being. And human beings are not meant to shut stuff out. They are not meant to bottle things up. We do react to stuff. We do have feelings. And I think that's a different kind of vulnerable. And I'm not quite sure where you are right now.
Well, that makes two of us. At the root of the kind of trauma discourse currently, there is this idea that merely by disclosing the details of what you think caused your trauma, you will find closure and meaning, and you will heal. No. This is not true.
No, it's not.
What is true is that you share your experience at an appropriate level in an appropriate context. And then you pass the mic to someone who offers insight into what you've just said. See, just telling the story over and over again, that is not necessarily helpful.
That really isn't helpful.
Yeah, even if
you have to tell it. You have to tell it in a different way.
Yeah. So that's one of the big aspects of the discourse that I want to get to with the campaign, is looking at that. And then there's the other thing as well, where we know that people who are abused could be likelier to perpetrate harm later if their trauma's not dealt with, or if they're neglected in some way, if certain behaviours aren't modelled to them. We understand that, everyone understands that. But for some reason, when we talk about trauma, we're willing to tell it all as long as we're telling the stuff that happened to us. I'm one of the few people in public life in Scotland who's openly talked about the things I've done wrong to other people. Because when people see themselves as trauma, they over-identify with the dynamics in which they were a victim. And they exclude all other possibilities of their behaviour.
Yeah, but they don't.
And that's why you see certain behaviour, and people don't believe that they're perpetrating harm against people because they believe they're acting from a righteous place. Yeah. They're acting from a traumatised place where the idea that they could be harming people the way that they were harmed is horrific to them. And they'll reject it out of hand and say that you're dismissing their trauma by implying that. And what I'm saying is, if we really care about trauma, we really care about discussing it openly, and we really care about healing, then we have to be prepared to look at certain things that don't make us feel righteous, that don't make us feel good. And that's something that I model all the time in all of the work that I do. And so really the book is an attempt to answer a question I get asked a lot, which is, I want to write a story about my life. Have you got any advice for me? Fucking right I do.
I don't entirely agree with you. I think we're all capable of hurting other people. I doubt that there's anybody here who hasn't in some way hurt another. And I think there's a risk of falling into the myth that if you've been abused, you are going to go on to abuse other people. The reality, or that you're a danger to your kids, and it does come up, but the reality is that most people who've been abused, who go on to have their own kids, for example, make a conscious choice to be a different kind of parent from the parents that hurt you.
Yeah.
That's my experience.
Yeah.
I have worked with people who've been in that perpetrator position.
Yeah.
But it's far more common that you find people who make a different decision, as I did.
Yeah, let me clarify quickly then. What I meant by that was simply, in a certain trauma algorithm, you can be very selective with what you're integrating and what you're not integrating.
Yeah.
And I know everyone has a similar proclivity for harming others, and that's life. What I mean is, in that trauma algorithm, we're encouraged to only look at the stuff that happened to us. And as a result, we begin to exclude other possibilities. And that's not insight, that's not maturity,
right. Yeah.
you know. But I get what you're saying.
And it's over-identifying with the victim.
Yeah, yeah.
The victim role.
And there's no healing in that.
Yeah, yeah. And
I'm getting signals from places. Are we done?
Last little bit.
Right. Okay, no worries. Anything you would like to say to take us out?
no, have we got time for some questions? That sounds dangerous.
No worries.
Have we got time for some questions or not?
I think we overran. I went on a bit long as usual.
We can either finish now if people need to leave, or we can add literally 5 minutes for questions. What? Can I have a show of hands? Finish now? Okay.
That's pretty good, isn't it?
So if I just chair a bit, because it's easier, then you can engage. Questions then, literally 5 minutes. So who's going to have their hand up first? Someone right at the back, please, on the back row. If you could say who you are, if you don't mind. If you don't want to say, that's fine, and say who your question's for. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. My name's Tornister. I just want to attest to what you just said about intergenerational trauma and people making different choices. I know that very well as the grandson of a paedophile rapist and the son of a child sexual abuse survivor, and I'm sure you can put the two together and work that one out.
Yeah.
What I'd like to ask you, Darren, in particular, Miriam, you said your definition was overwhelmingly ability of a person to cope on their own. And bearing that in mind, Darren, could you talk about class and trauma in the context of radical communities, activist communities, political communities, particularly in the environmental or the green movement? I mean, I know, if I recall correctly, you were involved in the Pollock 3 state as a ween, if I remember. Is that right?
As a kid, yeah.
As a kid, so yeah, could you talk about that and what your reflections would be now on the radical left or the progressive left at this point in relating to class and trauma?
I've written quite extensively about this in both my books, so I don't want to repeat old ground with it, but definitely anything that I've tried to express is related to cultural differences between social classes. So on one hand, you have a confident middle class, confident enough to assert what it needs, what it wants, what it deserves at that level. And also that class is also expressing its sense of vulnerability, its sense of fear, its sense of needing certain things to be in place and prior conditions to be before it can even feel safe. Conversely, then you have a bunch of other people who are not engaged in any way, who politicians don't give a shit about, they're not organised, and they live in conditions of deprivation. What are they being deprived of? Well, there's the economic liberty for a start, but there is also a whole onslaught of other forms of deprivation, including relational deprivation, broken families, addiction, comorbidity, co-occurring conditions, trauma and a mental health illness that's clinical in nature. All of these things create an environment where it's very difficult to lay down the roots required to foster genuine social connection, which is positively charged. And therefore what we see in those communities is social connections which are negatively charged, where fear often rules the day. And those people get a bit annoyed when they see middle-class activists running about all the time saying how fucking traumatised they are. Yeah. And that's just because of cultural differences. It's not dismissing one and platforming the other. It's just I'm in a position where I can articulate that because I've been on both sides of it.
Thank you very much. One last question, but before I give that opportunity, I don't want to assume that you'd be willing to take questions with people coming up to the stage. I don't know if you're comfortable with that or not. So can I just check whether you want people coming up or whether this is to both of you?
As long as we have a kind of agreement on how long that would go on for.
Well,
because I don't like lingering about, as you know from earlier when I was talking.
So we just say another
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, that's very generous. So one last question in the public forum, and you can form an orderly queue for further questions. So you caught my eye.
Marsha Scott.
Can you use the microphone?
Yes,
Thanks.
I can. I always ask other people too because I can't hear for shit. So my name's Marsha Scott. I work for Scottish Women's Aid, and I agree with so much of what was said, Darren. I just have a question, and it's not in my world. It's not the job of people who have been traumatized to fix the source of their trauma. So I'm not holding you responsible. I'm just asking, what would feel like this worked for you? Like, what is it that that your campaign? How will you feel like you've made a difference? Is it with the folk who come to you and say, tell me how to do this, or tell me when to stop, or tell me when to start?
I feel that my aim is to say some things that people are ruminating on right now that haven't quite been structured and laid out and clarified, that I think would help to refine how we look at lived experience, that I think would help to ground discussion about trauma back into something approaching a clinical thing rather than a colloquial thing. And finally, for those with lived experience who are being drawn in by an algorithm that says, tell the world about what happened, certain things have to be in place before you do that. Otherwise, if you're living with active trauma, you are in for literal hell, trust me. Yeah. And that's what I'm aiming to do with this whole project.
Thank you so much. So in trying to wrap up the event, I won't obviously do any summary. That would be futile and, just not appropriate. So thank you so much to Darren and Miriam for such an incredible event tonight. Miriam, early on you said defining trauma is like trying to capture smoke in a net. And I think we've had a bit of that tonight. I've certainly found it just incredible, and I know from the vibe in the room that that's been the case for many of us. If you want to catch up on tonight's event and many others in our programme, please check the YouTube channel where you will find this evening's event. And I would like to echo the thanks of our two guests tonight to the public engagement team who are standing at the back, particularly Hannah, but if you could show your appreciation to the team. Thank you. And in order not to cause them stress, I won't use the word trauma, obviously, not to cause them stress, we do need to leave this room by 8:30. And in order not to cause you guys stress, if you could form an orderly queue for questions. And I will keep an eye on the time that we leave this room at 8:30. So that's 8 minutes rather than your generous 10. So finally, thank you for joining us. And let's have one last round of applause for Darren and Miriam.
Thank you so much. It was really good. Thank you so much.